The note was held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a slice of watermelon, the kind they sell at every gas station between here and Knoxville. And I stood there in my coat with the car still ticking in the driveway and read it 3 times before the words stopped sliding off me. Gone to Cabo with Bren and a few friends. Mom came too. She's been needing a break. You'll stay and look after Grandpa Walt. He can't be alone and you're better at it than any of us. Back the 28th. Read. That was it. No phone number, no list of medications, no, I'm sorry, no, I love you. Just my husband's handwriting, slanted and rushed, the same hand that had signed our marriage license 5 years earlier in a courthouse in Asheville while I cried happy tears like a fool. 4 days later, he'd be the one crying, calling my phone from an airport bar until the battery died. But I didn't know that yet. Standing in that cold kitchen, all I knew was that the house was 60 degrees and silent and that I had driven 4 hours through the Christmas Eve traffic on I-40 with a trunk full of presents for a family that had packed up and flown to Mexico without me. He left it stuck to the icebox so you'd be sure to see it. I about jumped out of my skin. The voice came from the front room, low and dry, an old man's voice with gravel in it. I'd assumed the house was empty. I walked through and there he was. Walt, my husband's grandfather, sitting in a recliner by the window with a quilt over his knees and the television off. 81 years old. The man I'd met maybe 6 times in 5 years of marriage, always at a distance, always at the far end of somebody's table, always described to me by Reed and his mother as not all there anymore, as a handful, as a lot. He didn't look like a handful. He looked tired and thin and his lips had a grayish cast to them, but his eyes, when they found mine, were sharp as tacks. "You're the one Reed married," he said. "The pastry girl, Tessa." "Yes, sir." "They've been gone since Sunday." He nodded toward the kitchen, toward the note. "Lorraine told me you'd be coming to babysit. Her word, babysit." He said it the way you'd say a curse. "I'm sorry you got stuck with it. You drove all that way for nothing." I should have been furious, and I was. But underneath the fury was something colder and more confusing. They'd told me we were spending Christmas here in the Blue Ridge at the old family farmhouse outside Boone. Reed had said his grandfather wanted everyone together while he still could. I'd taken 3 days off from the bakery. I'd made an apple stack cake from scratch and wrapped presents for people who, it turned out, were sipping margaritas on a beach 1,000 miles south. "There's no food in the house," I said stupidly, because it was the only thing I could get my mouth to say. "There's a can of chicken and stars in the pantry and some bread that's mostly green," Walt said. They didn't stock the place. "Heat's down to 60 because Lorraine says propane's expensive. My pills are in the bathroom if you want to count them. Go count them." "Sir?" "Go count them." His eyes held mine. "Then come back and sit down. There's something I need to ask you, and I'd rather ask it knowing you've already seen what kind of people you married into." I went and counted them. I keep thinking about that moment, because everything after it grew out of it. If I hadn't gone and counted those pills, I might have just made the soup and turned up the heat and waited out the 4 days and driven home and filed for divorce quietly like a normal person. But I went and counted, and what I found in that bathroom cabinet changed the shape of the whole week. Walt had congestive heart failure, end stage. I learned the words later, but even that first night I could see the bottles didn't add up. There was a heart medication, a water pill, something for blood pressure, a little brown bottle of nitroglycerin. The dates on the pharmacy labels said the prescriptions had been filled 2 and 3 weeks back. The bottles were nearly full. Somebody had been giving him half of what the doctor ordered, or skipping days, stretching a 30-day supply into 60 to save on the copay. There was a yellow sticky note inside the cabinet door in a woman's handwriting, Lorraine's, I'd learn, that said cut the Entresto to 1x daily. I stood there holding that bottle, and I felt something turn over in my chest, slow and heavy like a key in a lock. When I came back to the front room, Walt was watching me. You found it. You're not taking the right amount. I'm not given the right amount. There's a difference. He shifted in the chair with a wince. My cardiologist wants me on the full dose. Lorraine decided that was eating into what she calls the household budget. Funny how the household budget always has room for her trips and her shopping and that lease on her Lexus, but not for keeping her own daddy's heart beating. Her daddy. I sat down on the edge of the couch. Lorraine is your daughter. My only one. Reed's mother. He laughed, and the laugh turned into a cough that doubled him over, and I went to him without thinking and put my hand on his back until it passed. When he sat up, there were tears in the corners of his eyes from the effort. Thank you, he said, surprised, like the gesture was something foreign to him. Nobody's done that in a long while. That was the first crack. After that, I couldn't have left him if I'd wanted to. I turned the heat up to 70, and I didn't care what the propane cost. I drove 40 minutes to the Ingalls in town that was still open on Christmas Eve, and I bought a small turkey breast and potatoes and butter and milk and eggs and a sack of oranges and proper bread. I bought a meat thermometer because the farmhouse didn't have one. The girl at the register wished me a Merry Christmas, and I almost cried right there in the checkout line because it was the first kind thing anyone had said to me all day, and it came from a stranger. I made supper. Nothing fancy. Roasted turkey and mashed potatoes and green beans I cooked down with a little bacon the way my own grandmother taught me. Walt ate slow, but he ate, and partway through he set down his fork and just looked at the plate. Reed brings me fast food, he said. When he comes at all. Drops a bag on the table and leaves it cold and tells me he's got somewhere to be. I can't remember the last time somebody put a hot meal in front of me at a table. He picked the fork back up. My Belle used to cook like this. My wife, been gone 12 years now. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be sharp. He pointed the fork at me. You're sitting in a house full of a dying man and his dying man's secrets, and the people who think they own both just flew to Mexico. I've been waiting a long time for somebody honest to walk through that door. I didn't expect it'd be you. But here you are. I asked him what he meant. He told me to fetch a shoebox from the back of his bedroom closet up on the shelf behind a stack of folded shirts. I brought it down. It was an ordinary box, the kind work boots come in, and inside it was the most carefully kept record of a slow betrayal I have ever seen in my life. Walt had been writing things down for 2 years. Spiral notebooks, the cheap ones from the dollar store, filled front to back in a cramped hand. The date Lorraine cut his medication. The date she canceled the cardiology follow-up because, she said, the drive was too far and gas was too dear. The check stubs. He kept copies, where money came out of his account for home health aid and medical supplies that never showed up. There'd never been an aid. The supplies never came. There was a column of withdrawals from his savings, small ones, $200 and $300 at a time, with Lorraine's name on the memo line going back longer than the notebooks did. She has power of attorney, Walt said. Got it 3 years ago when I had my first bad spell. Told me it was just in case. In case has turned into a faucet she leaves running. He tapped the box. Reed knows. He gets a little of it. New truck last spring. You ever wonder how a man who installs gutters affords a $60,000 truck? That's where it came from. Out of my account. Out of me. I sat there on the floor of his bedroom with that shoebox in my lap, and I thought about the down payment Reed and I had been saving for. The joint account I'd been feeding half my paycheck into for 3 years. The house we were always about to buy, just as soon as the timing was right. I went and looked at my phone, at our banking app, right there in front of him. 4 days ago, a withdrawal of $6,000. The trip to Cabo. The trip with Brennan. The coworker he'd been mentioning more and more. The one he swore was just somebody from the office. I think I made a sound. Walt looked at me and his face softened in a way I hadn't seen yet. He took yours too, he said. It wasn't a question. Our savings. Then we've both been robbed by the same hands. He reached over from the bed and put his cold, papery fingers on my wrist. Tessa, I am asking you for help, and I want you to understand exactly what I'm asking before you answer. I don't have long. My heart's running out of road. Could be weeks. The doctor says, maybe less the way they've been rationing my pills. I have things I need to set right before I go, and I cannot do it alone, and the only family I have left is on a beach pretending I'm already dead. He squeezed, surprisingly strong. Help me get my house in order. Help me make sure the people who treated me like a chore don't get to profit off the day I die. And I will make sure that you, the one person under this roof who turned the heat up and counted my pills and cooked me a real supper, walk out of this the way you deserve to. I want to tell you I thought it over. I didn't. I said yes before he finished asking. The next morning was Christmas. There was a dusting of snow on the mountains, the first of the year, and when I brought Walt his coffee, he was looking out the window at it with an expression I can't quite name. Maybelle used to make snow cream the first good snow, he said. Bowl of clean snow, milk, sugar, a drop of vanilla. Hadn't had it since she passed. Lorraine says it's filthy, eating snow. He shook his head. Filthy, eating snow. He shook his head. Filthy. That woman. So I made snow cream on Christmas morning. I went out into the yard in my socks and Reed's old boots and scooped the cleanest snow I could find into a mixing bowl, and I stirred in milk and sugar and the half bottle of vanilla I found in the cupboard. And I carried it in and set it in front of an 81-year-old man who took one bite and closed his eyes and didn't say anything for a long time. When he opened them, they were wet. Tastes just like hers, he said. 12 years? 12 years. Nobody bothered to remember. That was the morning I stopped thinking of this as a scheme and started thinking of it as something closer to a duty. We still worked, make no mistake, we worked. But the work and the caring got braided together until I couldn't tell them apart. Here is what we did in the days that followed, and I'll tell you plainly because I'm not ashamed of any of it. I called the number on the business card paper clipped to the inside of Walt's notebook. It belonged to a woman named Harriet Vance, an estate attorney down in Boone who'd done some work for Walt years back, before Lorraine got her hooks in. Walt had been afraid to call her himself, afraid Lorraine monitored his phone, and she did. I checked, and there was a tracking app on it that Reed had installed for emergencies. Miss Vance came out to the farmhouse the day after Christmas in a Subaru with chains on the tires. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, sharp as a paring knife, and when she shook my hand, she looked at me a long moment and said, "Walt told me on the phone you were the honest one. Let's find out." We spent that whole day at the kitchen table. Ms. Vance explained things I'd never had to understand before, that the power of attorney Lorraine held could be revoked by Walt as long as he was of sound mind, and that we'd want a doctor to put that soundness on paper to head off any fight later, that the smartest move, cleaner than a will, was a revocable living trust. So the house and the accounts would pass straight to whoever Walt named without ever going through probate, without ever giving Lorraine a courtroom to make noise in, that everything had to be witnessed and notarized properly, or it wasn't worth the paper. They will contest it, Miss Vance said, looking at me over her glasses. People like this always do, so we do it right or we don't do it at all. We did it right. A doctor came, a friend of Miss Vance's, a sweet-faced man who examined Walt for an hour, asked him the date and the president and to count backward from 100 by sevens, and wrote out a letter certifying that Walter Brenner was mentally competent and acting of his own free will. A notary came 2 days later, a quiet older man named Mr. Bauer, who watched Walt sign each page and pressed his seal into each one and shook Walt's hand on the way out and said, "Good luck to you, sir." Walt revoked the power of attorney. He moved the house, the farm, his savings, a brokerage account I'd had no idea existed, all of it into a trust. He'd been frugal his whole life, 60 years installing and then owning a heating and cooling business, paying himself in steady dividends, never flashy. The truck in his barn was a 2004 Ford he'd kept running himself. The man Lorraine treated like a beggar had close to $1 million she'd never managed to find because he'd kept it under a name and a bank she didn't know about, the same way he'd kept those notebooks. He left the bulk of it to me. He left a chunk to the local volunteer fire department and a chunk to a charity that helps elderly folks who can't afford their medications, and the rest to me. And when I tried to argue, he held up his hand and said, "It's mine to give, and you're the only one who earned it. Don't insult me by refusing." But the legal part isn't what I remember most. What I remember is the rest of it. I remember the neighbors. The first afternoon, a woman from across the road named Miss June showed up with a casserole and a coconut cake, and when she came in and saw me, a stranger, caring for Walt with the family gone, she sat down at the table and talked for 2 hours and told me things that made my blood run cold. How Walt had fallen in the yard back in October and lain there 40 minutes before her husband Roy found him, because nobody answered the door. Though Reed's truck was in the drive. How the whole road knew the family only came around to take and never to give. How everybody had stopped expecting better. By the end, she was holding my hand and promising to tell the others. And over the next 3 days, a steady little parade of mountain people came through that door with food and firewood and stories. And every one of them I wrote down dates and names because Miss Vance had told me that witnesses matter. I remember the apple stack cake, the one I'd made for a Christmas that never happened. I cut it the second night, and Walt ate 2 pieces and told me his mother used to make it for the threshing crews when he was a boy, and we sat in the lamplight while he talked about a North Carolina that doesn't exist anymore. Mule teams and party-line telephones and a one-room school he walked 3 miles to. And I just listened, because nobody had listened to this man in years, and it turned out he was full of a whole century. I remember reading to him. His eyes were bad and his hands shook too much to hold a book, but he had a shelf of paperback westerns, soft and broken-spined, and his favorite was an old Louis L'Amour with the cover half torn off. I read him Hondo in pieces, an hour at a time, and he'd correct me when I rushed and tell me where he thought the man would draw. I found his record player in the closet and a stack of Patsy Cline records, and I played them low in the evenings, and once he hummed along to Walkin' After Midnight in a thin, cracked voice, and I had to leave the room so he wouldn't see me cry. And I remember the phone calls, because I won't lie to you about those. Reed's sister Delia was the only one in the family who texted to check on Walt. Once, on the 26th, a single message. "How's Grandpa holding up?" I texted her back the truth, mostly. That his heart was failing fast. That I was managing his comfort as best I could. That if anyone wanted to say goodbye, the window was closing. I sent her a photo of Walt asleep in his chair, gray and small under his quilt. And it wasn't staged. It was just how he looked. And Delia wrote back, "Oh no, keep me posted." And then, an hour later, "Should we try to come back early?" The flights are so expensive to change though, and Mom says he's been dying for 2 years. LOL. I read that one out loud to Walt, and he just nodded, like a man confirming the weather. "There it is," he said. "Their hearts, in writing. Save it." I saved it. I called Reed too. He never answered. I knew he wouldn't. His phone was off or ignoring me. But I left messages, calm ones, factual ones. "Your grandfather is declining. The hospice nurse says it could be soon. He's asking for the family. Please call." I didn't beg. I didn't perform. I just laid the facts down like stones and let them gather message after message, a record of every chance they had and didn't take. The hospice nurse was a woman named Carmen who came every other day, then every day. She was the one who told me on the 27th, taking me out onto the cold front porch so Walt wouldn't hear, that his kidneys were shutting down and his lungs were filling, and that we'd moved past weeks into days, maybe hours. "Do you want me to call his family?" she asked. Sometimes people change their minds when it's real. I looked through the window at Walt dozing in his chair, the snow coming down soft behind the glass, and I thought about that message. He's been dying for 2 years, Lamol. And I said no. They'd made their choice on a beach with a drink in their hands. This was his time, and it would belong to the people who'd shown up for it. The last day was a Sunday. I knew before Carmen confirmed it. Walt was quieter. His breathing had a wet rattle in it. His hands and feet had gone cool and a little blue. But his mind stayed clear right to the edge, which Carmen said was a mercy and a rare one. In the afternoon, he asked me to bring the bottle of bourbon from the cabinet over the stove. It was an old bottle, the wax seal still on it, the label gone amber with age. Mabel and I bought that the year we married, he said. Saving it for our 60th. We made it to 48. He smiled, the saddest, gentlest smile I've ever seen on a human face. I reckon I'm allowed to open it now. I found 2 jelly jars in the cupboard and poured us each a swallow. I lifted mine and didn't know what to say. To Mabel, Walt said, and to getting the last word, we touched glasses. The bourbon was smooth and dark and tasted like a fire in an old house. That evening, I helped him into the recliner by the window so he could watch the snow, and I put Patsy Cline on low, and I read him the last chapter of Hondo, even though I don't think he was tracking the words anymore. Around 11, his breathing slowed and spaced out, and I set the book down and took his hand. There wasn't any drama to it. No last speech, no clutching, no movie. He breathed out, and a while passed, and then he didn't breathe in, and the room was just the record turning and the snow falling and me holding the hand of a man I'd known for 6 days who somehow mattered to me more than the husband I'd known for 6 years. I sat with him a long time before I called Carmen. She came at dawn and confirmed what I already knew, and she stood in the doorway looking at his face and said, "He looks peaceful." They don't always. I told her he'd gone out listening to Patsy Cline with bourbon on his breath, and she said that was about the best a person could ask for, and I believe she meant it. The funeral home came. One of the men knew Walt from the Lions Club and shook my hand with both of his. Miss June came across the road in her housecoat and held me on the porch while they carried him out. And then the house was empty in a way it hadn't been even when I'd first walked into it, and I had a day and a half before the family flew home, and I knew exactly what I needed to do with it. I called Ms. Vance. She came that afternoon and we made the arrangements, a small graveside service the next morning, just neighbors and a few old friends from Walt's church, the people who'd actually known him. He was buried beside Mabel in a cemetery on a hill outside town with the mountains laid out blue behind it, and 40 people came in the cold, and not one of them was named Brenner or Calloway. Then I went back to the farmhouse and I got ready for the others to come home. I didn't trash the place or scream into the void or any of the things you imagine doing. I cleaned it. I set Walt's shoebox of notebooks on the kitchen table, and beside it the bank statements with the highlighted withdrawals, and the sticky note about cutting his medication, and Delia's text printed out big, and the doctor's competency letter, and the trust documents with Mr. Tame, Bauer's notary seal pressed into every page. I propped a framed photo of Walt and Mabel on the mantel. And on top of the stack, I laid an envelope, because Walt had dictated a letter to Miss Vance. 2 days before he died, his voice steady the whole time, and I'd promised him I'd read it out loud to them myself. They came home on the 28th, just like the note said. I heard the rental car in the gravel a little after noon, heard the doors slam and the laughter, the bags rustling. I stood up from Walt's recliner and smoothed down the black dress I'd worn to bury him. Reed came in first, sunburned and grinning, a duty-free bag in each hand, with that woman Bryn behind him in a sundress that was all wrong for a North Carolina December, and Lorraine behind her in big sunglasses, and Delia last, looking less sure than the rest. Reed's grin caught when he saw me standing there in black. "Hey," he said, "why are you dressed like that? Where's Grandpa?" "Your grandfather passed away," I said. Sunday night, I buried him yesterday. The bags hit the floor. Lorraine pushed past her son, yanking off her sunglasses. What do you mean, buried him? You can't just, that's not, where's Daddy? And there it was. The first time in years anyone had called him Daddy, and only because she'd lost something she thought she owned. He's in the cemetery next to your mother, I said. It was a lovely service. 40 people came. The fire department sent flowers. His neighbors carried him. I let that land. I left you 4 messages, Reed. I told Delia he was dying. You all knew. Mom? Delia said quietly, and Lorraine shot her a look that could have stripped paint. Reed's face was doing something complicated, shock and grief, and underneath it both, working its way up fast, the thing I'd watched take over completely in about 90 seconds. Calculation. Okay, he said. Okay, we'll deal with the service stuff. Tessa, sit down. We need to talk about the estate, the house. We do, I said. Sit down. There's a letter. They sat. Nobody took Walt's recliner. I picked up the envelope and I read them his words, and I'm not going to give you all of it because some of it was his and his alone, but I'll tell you it began to the family that wasn't, and it laid out, plain and without anger. The canceled appointments and the rationed pills and the money and the day he lay in the yard while his grandson watched football, and it ended with a line. I'll carry the rest of my life. The worst part of dying isn't the leaving. It's learning at the very end that the people you raised were only ever waiting for the house to clear. When I finished, the room was dead silent except for Bryn shifting her weight by the door, clearly wishing she were anywhere else on earth. He was confused, Lorraine said finally, her voice tight. He hadn't been right in the head for years. None of this means anything legally. I have power of attorney. Had, I said. He revoked it, with a doctor's letter certifying he was perfectly sound and a notary and witnesses. I gestured at the table. It's all there. So is the medication you cut to save money. So is the text your daughter sent me from the beach about how he'd been dying for 2 years. Delia made a small noise and put her face in her hands. The doorbell rang. I timed it. I'll admit that. Miss Vance stood on the porch in her good coat with a leather folder under her arm. Am I interrupting? She asked, in a voice that did not care if she was. Not at all, I said. They were just getting up to speed. She came in and set the folder on the table and introduced herself as the successor trustee of the Walter Brenner Living Trust. And she explained, in language none of them could argue with, that the house they were standing in did not belong to them and never would, that it had passed, the moment Walt died, into a trust, that the accounts Lorraine had been drawing from were frozen pending an audit, and that the audit might turn up things a person wouldn't want a district attorney looking at, given what the notebooks documented, that the entirety of the estate, the house, the farm, the savings went to me with provisions for charity, and that Walt had been examined by 2 doctors and witnessed by a notary, and that anyone who wanted to contest it was welcome to spend money they didn't have on a lawsuit they would lose. Reed had gone the color of paper. The house is mine, he said, and his voice cracked on it. Grandpa always said, Mom, you said. We assumed, Lorraine said, and for the first time she sounded like she understood. We assumed. What about my tuition fund? Dahlia asked, very small. Grandpa set one up. He told me. Ms. Vance looked at her, not unkindly. He gave your father money for that years ago. There's no record it was ever deposited anywhere but his own account. Delia turned to look at her brother, and the look on her face, that was the moment the family really ended, I think, not the will. That look. They started in on each other then, the accusations flying, Lorraine and Reed and Delia all talking over one another, and Bryn slipped out the front door and I heard the rental car start, and I figured that was the last anyone would see of her. I let them go at it a minute, And then I walked back to the bedroom and got my suitcase, which I packed that morning. And on my way out, I stopped to pull my own things off the joint statements I'd printed and slide them in beside the cruise charges. The whole timeline lay bare. His arm around another woman on one page and his grandfather's death certificate on the next. Reed followed me into the hall. The fight had drained out of him and something worse had taken its place. Fear, and the oily charm I'd fallen for once, switching back on like a porch light. Tess. Baby, come on. He reached for my arm and I stepped back. Bryn was nothing. A mistake. I was stressed. The business, I wasn't thinking. We can fix this. We can sell the house, split it, start fresh, you and me. I'll change. I swear to God I'll change. I looked at him for what felt like a long time. The handsome face, the easy mouth, the man I'd built a life around who had stuck a note to a refrigerator and flown to Mexico while his grandfather's heart gave out alone. Except not alone, because I'd been there, because they'd accidentally left him the one person who'd stay. I worked my wedding ring off my finger. I took the apartment key off my ring too, the little brass one, and I set them both in his open palm and closed his fingers over them. You left a dying man for a beach, I said. You don't get to come back and find out it cost you everything and call it a fresh start. I picked up my suitcase. You always told me to read the fine print, Reed. I finally did. I walked out into the cold. The snow had stopped and the sky over the mountains had gone that pale washed gold it gets just before sunset in the high country, and the air was so clean it hurt to breathe it. Behind me I could hear them still going, Lorraine's voice climbing, demanding Miss Men's. Vance explained how this could have happened, but the words were already getting smaller, already turning into something behind me instead of around me. Miss June was on her porch across the road. She didn't say anything. She just lifted one hand and held it up, and I lifted mine back, and that was the whole goodbye, and it was enough. I put the suitcase in the trunk, and I sat in the driver's seat for a minute before I turned the key. I wasn't thinking about Reed or the money or even the look on Lorraine's face when she understood she'd flown to Cabo and lost a fortune. I was thinking about snow cream on Christmas morning, about a thin, cracked voice humming Patsy Cline, about a man who'd waited 2 years with a shoebox full of notebooks for somebody honest to walk through his door, and how it had turned out to be me, the babysitter, the afterthought, the one they couldn't be bothered to bring along. Walt had gotten his last word. Now I had the rest of my life to use mine well. I started the car and drove down the mountain toward town, and for the first time and longer than I could remember, the road ahead of me belonged to nobody but me. I've thought a lot about that refrigerator note since then, about how a single slip of paper told me everything I needed to know about 3 different people. Reed believed he could fly to Cabo and the world would simply hold still for him, that a man can take his wife's savings and his grandfather's medicine money and never once have to look at the cost. He was wrong. And he was wrong for a reason that has nothing to do with luck. The 4 days that broke him weren't fate. They were the bill coming due for 100 small choices he'd made when he thought nobody honest was watching. You can't ration an old man's heart pills to Lisa Lexus and expect the universe to keep your secret. Things you do in the dark have a way of being read aloud at a kitchen table later. What saved me wasn't cleverness, not really. When I walked into Walt's cold house, I had no plan, no shoebox of evidence, no attorney's number in my pocket. What I had was a decision, made in the doorway of a bathroom while I counted pills that didn't add up, that I was not going to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. That's the part I'd want my own daughter to understand someday. The whole thing turned not on a lawyer or a trust or a clever bit of timing, but on one ordinary woman refusing to look away from something wrong. Doing right is rarely loud. Sometimes it's just turning the heat up to 70 and meaning it. But meaning well wasn't enough on its own, and I want to be honest about that too. If I'd only had a good heart, Lorraine would have buried me in court and walked off with the farmhouse. It took more than caring. It took listening when Walt explained how a power of attorney works, writing down every neighbor's name and date, calling Harriet Vance instead of calling Reed, and crying. Kindness without good sense is just a soft target. The peaches and cream tenderness and the notarized paperwork had to live in the same week, in the same woman, or none of it would have held. And it took something I didn't know I had until that house demanded it of me. Anyone can be brave for an afternoon. Staying, night after night, with a dying man you barely know, when leaving would have been so easy and so understandable, when no one would have blamed you for driving home. That's a quieter, harder kind of strength, the kind you build out of small refusals to quit. So when people ask me what I learned alone in that farmhouse with Walt, I tell them this. Be the person who counts the pills. Be smart enough to count them right and write down what you find. And be steady enough to stay until the counting's done, even when the counting breaks your heart. The people on the beach are betting their whole lives that no one like that will ever walk through the door. Prove them wrong. Walt waited 2 years for someone to. I'm glad it was me.